Friday the 13th, Carnival of Maniacs, Chapter 14. The narrow track leading down to Harper Field was deluged with fleeing casualties. People were running and screaming. They banged on the windows of Tollison's Chrysler and cried for help. Some of them had terrible burns, others were pouring with blood. Kyler saw a child of about 9 crying for their mother and father. And everywhere there was blind panic. "My God, it's a nightmare," said Tollison, but his partner said nothing as she carefully followed the rescue party to the bottom of the asphalt lane, to the side of mass murder. The fire Pamela had set in motion was still eating through Whitney's beloved monsters, casting a satanic glow over the carpet of the slain. Police officers and paramedics were already rushing through the scattered victims, seeing who was dead and who might be saved. 2 groups of patrolmen had drawn their guns and were searching the scene for the perpetrator. Kyler prayed for their sakes they weren't successful. Tollis had pointed through the windshield. "There!" he said excitedly. It was so black outside that Kyler could see nothing but the grass illuminated in her headlamps, so she slowed down and cut the lights, and then she saw it. 2 tiny taillights were climbing behind a fan of white light into the hills on the far side of the clearing. Even though it was hard to make out in the dark, Kyler guessed that the mountain trail would be slow and hazardous, and it was in completely the opposite direction from where everyone else was fleeing. In short, someone was trying to escape. Kyler checked to see if any of the squad cars were giving chase, but no one except the agents had even spotted the lone vehicle. She looked at Tollison. He stared back at her. "Do it," he said decisively. Kyler thrashed the gas pedal, and the Chrysler went streaming in pursuit. The engine of the old pickup wheezed and whined as Alice forced the vehicle up an even steeper grade. Dirt slipped from under the doubled rear tires, and Jason's body slid down the smooth metal of the flat bed, his feet slamming against the tailgate, followed soon after by a more muted thud. Suddenly, Alice realized she'd left the travel bag, with the severed head and the laptop, in the back of the truck. "Damn!" She banged the palm of her hand against the steering wheel and looked ahead for somewhere more level where she could park. But the trail continued to climb as far as she could see. Worse, it was gradually bearing right, towards the sheer side of the hill. "Oh, you can't stop now, dear," said a voice up close. "They're right behind us." Alice was imagining that woman again. But although she seriously feared for her own sanity, she instinctively glanced into the mirrors and saw a set of headlamps quickly gaining on her. And that's not all she saw, because smiling at her in the glass with lineaments thin and spectral in the moonlight was the arrogant face of Pamela Voorhees. "You know," said Pamela idly, "I've never cared much for Alice. It's a horrible name." "Shut up!" shouted Alice, punching the rear view. The glass cracked and her knuckles bled, but the mocking face remained in the mirror. "It's seen us!" hollered Tollison as the truck picked up speed in front of them, kicking dust in its wake. "They'll have to do better than that," answered Kyler grimly. She put the headlamps on high beam and fed even more power to the transmission. Tollison's Chrysler wasn't built for steep, unpaved trails like this, and yet they were having no trouble reeling in Kenton's pickup. Kyler pounded the horn and flashed her lights, but the truck wouldn't stop. If anything, it moved even faster. If this had been a bureau vehicle rather than Tollison's personal car, Kyler would have used the siren to let whoever it was know they were being pursued by law enforcement officers. Maybe then they wouldn't be so eager to go off-road racing. "Hold on," she warned her partner. The car surged forward as Kyler revved it into an overtaking position, but the pickup swung wide, anticipating the maneuver and killing it before it had even begun. Kyler's top lip peeled back above her teeth, and her brows pitched forward as she cut right, then left, jammed the car forwards, but then abruptly pulled back. The trail was too damn steep and uneven for Kyler to build up enough speed to get by the truck. "Hey, take it easy," warbled Tollison, white as a sheet. But Kyler was stopping for no man. She gunned the Chrysler straight into an impossible space, and the 2 vehicles connected. Wham! The agents were rocked back in their seats as the saloon rebounded off the rear side of the pickup. Kyler swung in for a second blow, and again they glanced off the heavy metal bodywork. The right headlamp went out in a ricochet of broken glass. "Kyler!" shouted Tollison, bracing himself. They had only one beam working now, but that was all the light Kyler needed to slam the fender into the back of the truck. 2, 3 times. Each impact was like a nail in the coffin of Satan. But still the pickup climbed the hill in front of her. Kyler eased off in preparation for one final attempt. Then she stabbed forward and crashed all 200 horsepower dead center on the license plates. The rear gate of the pickup crumpled with the collision, and Kyler came off the gas only to realize that her car had been snagged by the pickup's tow hook. This was her chance. She stamped on the brakes, and Tollison saw with horror that she was about to reach for the gear shift. "What the hell are you doing?" he hollered. The Chrysler skidded and buckled as its locking wheels fought to drag the pickup to a halt. Kyler could feel resistance mounting through the very fabric of the vehicle, as the driver of the truck pressed equally hard on the gas. Then Kyler wrenched the gears into reverse. The car screamed. It was being subjected to impossible forces, and the cross-directional power was mechanical torture. The truck strained to climb up the hill while the car labored to pull it back down. It was an insane tug-of-war, crawling up the dirt track and sliding in a zigzag that could only end in roadkill. Suddenly, the whole back of the pickup, the tow hook, the fender, and the bent rear gate, all broke free and came spinning towards the windshield. Tollison raised his arms in front of his face, and Kyler lowered her head just in time as the tailstorm smashed the glass into 1,000 prismatic fragments and then rebounded onto the roadside. Kyler struggled to get the vehicle back under control, but she could barely see the trail and was aware at any moment they could go careening over the side of the hill. Tollison took out his gun and used the handle to punch a hole in the crystal cobweb in front of him. Smoke was rising from under the hood. The car went hurtling up the bumpy track and was sideswiping every rock and tree along the way. "Look!" shouted Tollison, his eyes watering with the rush of air. Kyler squinted forward and saw a pair of feet resting on the bed of the truck. There was a body in the back of the vehicle, and now that the rear gate was gone, the body was sliding forwards out onto the road. No more than 5 yards in front, Alice Whitney was frantic. Somebody was trying to kill her. At first she thought it might be the cops, but there were no sirens, no lights, and the crazy fucking bastards had tried to run her off the road. When their vehicles had got snarled up and they tried to haul her back, she thought the pickup was going to explode. The engine was making that much noise. But somehow she'd broken free, and now she was driving out of her skin. She knew she was good behind the wheel, but Jesus shit. "My son!" shouted her new multiple personality disorder. "You're losing my son!" Thanks to Alice's punch, the rearview mirror was no good. She glanced over her shoulder and was horrified to see both Jason and the travel bag sliding out of the truck. "I can't stop!" she cried, the headlamps of the Chrysler sticking to her tire marks. "You must!" snarled Pamela. "They can't have my Jason." "If I stop, they'll kill me!" Alice shouted. "Not if I kill you first, you little slut!" Suddenly, Alice's hands were no longer her own. They seesawed left and right over the steering wheel in an ectoplasmic effort to turn the truck around. Alice stared out of the window and screamed. The instant the pickup veered out of control, Jason shot out of the vehicle like a human missile. His feet, his legs, and his body all slid onto the dirt in swift succession, only for his hockey mask to get caught on a jutting piece of metal where the fender used to be. And suddenly he was being dragged full length behind the truck. His limbs shook and thrashed over each bump and hole in the road. Sparks flew up from the heels of his boots. Columns of dust mushroomed all around him, and his twitching, juddering frame was center stage in Kyler's one good headlamp. Her eyes widened and her mouth fell open. At long last she had found the man who had killed her mother. Jason Voorhees was real. "Watch out!" cried Tollison. But the sight of Jason had distracted Kyler long enough for her to miss the sharp right bend. She wrenched at the wheel, but the car was already committed. The pickup disappeared round the corner of the hillside, pulling Jason with it like a hog-tied bandit. But the Chrysler went flying over the edge. All four wheels left the ground, and the FBI agents found themselves falling towards a slope of dense pine wood. Back up on the road, the sudden turn had caused the rear of the pickup to yank sideways, and had sent the travel bag spinning past Jason's head. The fabric carrier tumbled in the red glow of the receding taillights, and bounced along the dirt before catching on a stray branch and ripping wide open. Tollison screamed as the automobile rolled over to meet the serried treetops of the forest. Pine needles lashed through the windshield. His body was jostled by the pinball descent. From the moment they'd left the road, his life had turned into a game of cards, and until the vehicle stopped moving, he wouldn't know if he was pulling 21 or bust. Sitting in the open bag, the head of Pamela Voorhees was bathed in glorious moonlight, and Jason was no longer the rag doll in the exhaust. His body stiffened, and he frantically reached round for whatever it was that was holding on to his mask. He lifted his legs and tried to run with the scrolling of the road. But his boots slipped on the sandy earth, and his lower body swayed in an outstretched wave like a sidewinder with a V8 engine up its ass. And yet slowly, ever so slowly, he raised his arms and clamped them on the top of the bed. Then, almost as if he were bench pressing 350 pounds behind his head, he raised himself just enough to unhook the mask from the twisted shard. The feat seemed impossible, yet Jason continued to defy possibility. Next, he placed one hand on the side of the truck and then climbed up onto the trailer. For all the distance he'd just been dragged, and for all the jolts that would have broken any other man's neck, Jason stood victorious on the back of Freely's pickup, seemingly unaffected by the vehicle's lurching, haphazard motion. He turned his ungodly stare at the cabin. He had some unfinished business to attend to. Out of the darkness came pain. Out of the pain came awareness. Snapping back to full consciousness, Kyler saw her partner slumped dead or unconscious beside her. Blood was trickling from her forehead, and the two of them were sitting upside down, the roof of the car an imploded stalactite mere inches from her face. "Corey?" she called gently. She reached over and felt for a pulse. He was still alive. "Agent Tollison," she said louder. After the fury of the chase, everything seemed unnaturally quiet. The car creaked and hissed as it settled into scrap. But other than that, Kyler could hardly hear a thing. Carefully, she unhooked her seatbelt and lowered herself onto the roof of the vehicle. The side window was already smashed, but it took a few additional blows to make it safe to crawl through. She climbed groggily to her feet on the forest floor and slowly set about examining herself. She was covered in minor wounds, but miraculously didn't feel as if she'd broken any bones. No internal injuries, not even a mild concussion, as far as she could tell. Satisfied with her status, Kyler went round to the passenger side of the Chrysler and saw Tollison hanging there. Her initial reaction was to reach for the door handle, but then a more urgent thought tore through her mind. Jason! Kyler quickly ran her eyes over the automobile. There didn't seem to be any immediate danger. Then she checked her cell, but there was no signal. Again, she looked at Tollison, bleeding and upside down. But the truck carrying Jason had to be stopped. Aching and tired, she took one last look at the Chrysler, and then began a long and arduous climb back up the rise. Alice didn't know what was happening to her. She'd seen that sharp ride on the edge of the hill and had thought she was finished, but somehow she'd regained control of her hands and was able to make the turn with a few feet to spare. Judging from the sudden quiet, she guessed her pursuers hadn't been so lucky. The last few minutes had gone without a single crash, a flash of headlamps or anything, which meant she had escaped. Problem was, she'd also lost Jason. It seemed to Alice she would always be cursed to have either freedom or hope, but never both. She heard the engine straining and realized she had cramp in her foot, from treading so hard on the gas. The trail here was still ascending, and the truck rocked from side to side as it lumbered over the uneven ground. But Alice was no longer in any real peril. Jason and her pursuers were all gone, and when she sobered up, the voice in her head would be gone as well. Alice counted to 10 and forced herself to ease off the pedal. Then she breathed deeply and told herself to calm down and stop taking risks with the road. It was all over now. She had to relax. It was finished. Over. The rear window exploded behind her as Jason reached both arms into the cab and placed them around her head like a vice. Alice screamed. The van swerved, and the bastard squeezed harder. The gradient was never so steep that Kyler had to use her hands, nor was the hill so high that she got out of breath. But the one thing the climb did kill was time. When she regained the spot where her car had left the road, the pickup was long gone. Damn! In the light of the full moon, the tire marks told an obvious story. One that was no use to Kyler, because she'd already read the last page. She took her cell out and checked for a signal. It was weak, but she definitely had one. But who to call? Every police officer for miles around would be down on Harper Field dealing with the aftermath of Jason's atrocities. And the FBI, well, she was their public enemy number one. Suddenly, another idea crossed her mind. It was a long shot, but she lifted the keypad before she saw something odd lying by the side of the road. The object was partially hidden in the underbrush, and Kyler couldn't quite make out what it was. But the presence of any unusual object here was cause for concern. She went over for a closer look. The head of Mrs. Voorhees was malevolent in the moonlight. Kyler had found the travel bag. No matter how violently Alice turned the wheel, Jason would not let go of her. She tried pulling his hands away, but he was too strong. She dug her nails into his skin that had died long ago. But that had proven equally futile. So now she was trying to shake him off by swerving the pickup. But Jason wouldn't release her, and she was starting to feel an unnatural pain, an organic movement in the stem of her neck that said he was ripping her head off. The pain pushed her beyond reason. Jason was causing irreversible damage to her cells. She was separating, and suddenly she was screaming. Now was the time for piteous, instinctive thrashing. The 5 flailing legs of the fly after one has just been pulled off. She punched Jason's mask and tried to bite him, but his movement through the broken window was erratic, and his fingers were all over her. Alice Whitney was finished. Kyler felt as if someone had just walked across her grave. A shiver of prescience palpitated through her heart as she stared at the cadaver eyes. Mrs. Pamela Voorhees, born 1930, died 1980. Murderess and mother of one Jason Voorhees. For Kyler, this was the final piece of the jigsaw puzzle. The kids from Seattle had gone to Crystal Lake and discovered the shack mentioned in 1984 by Jenny Field. That was where they'd found the severed head, and that's what had set Jason into motion. Either because they'd removed the head, or Jason didn't want them to see it, or because of some pathological mother-son dynamic. Jason had gone on the offensive, and then he'd been hit by the carnival trucks and brought to Hunt Ridge. Even so, who was driving the pickup truck? And what were they doing with Jason's body? Why not hand him over to the police? And what about Jason himself? After he'd been dragged along the road, was he dead? It seemed to Kyler that someone had just thrown another 1,000 pieces into the jigsaw box. Still, if nothing else came from the debacle of an investigation, she'd at least obtained an invaluable source of DNA. She put the head back in the bag and closed it. Speeding wildly out of control, the pickup somehow emerged onto smooth asphalt. The trail had ended on the high mountain road a few miles north of Hunt Ridge. But that was no consolation to the dying woman. Blood streamed from her nose as tiny holes were torn like Swiss cheese into the sinews of her neck. She fought and screamed and bunched up her shoulders, trying to resist the unavoidable separation of muscle. "What's taking you so long?" she shouted. "Why don't you just fucking kill me?" The pickup veered over onto the oncoming lane and bore straight into the path of a gigantic haulage truck. The huge trailer flashed its headlamps and sounded its horn, urging Alice to get out of the way. 2 rows of lights burst into life along the top and center of the high chromium cab, blinding Alice, making her feel closer to heaven, and she begged her father for understanding, just as Jason let go. Choking with snot and blood, her mouth filling with the clear viscous fluid that tasted of damage, Alice heaved and spat, but somehow managed to pull the pickup out of the way of disaster. The vehicle skidded and turned 180 on the sandy verge, before slapping against the side of the hill and then scraping to a dead stop. Alice threw up all over her dress as the gleaming trailer went roaring past, the trucker signaling his anger with the unrelenting drone of his horn. Alice tried to look back through the rear window of the cab, but her neck was in agony and she couldn't move it at all. Carefully, she turned her whole body and saw Jason lying flat out on the bed. He was dormant once more, but for how long? How long? She reached over to the glove box, the movement causing her to cry with pain, and took out a bottle of Jack Daniels. But she barely started to unwrap the top when she booted open the door and threw the bottle to the ground. It smashed, flooding the soil with Band-Aid comforts. "Oh, God!" Alice was hurt, angry, frightened. She'd been almost killed. She tried to hold back the tears, but it was impossible. Her father, Jason, if she could just hold it together for another few hours. But Christ, her neck hurt. She slumped forward against the steering wheel and broke down, sobbing with every ache of her heart. Chapter 15. As much as Jaomi was addicted to Zingbid, her idea of a great evening was not spending hours in front of the computer, reloading the same damn page over and over and yawn over again. "Ross, this is a total waste of time," she grouched. "The auction's not due for another 19 hours. "I know," he said appreciatively, "but just do it one more time." The 2 of them were huddled in Jaomi's office, a pink purgatory festooned with posters of such direct-to-video classics as The Maltese Hard-On, A Nice Pair on Elm Street. A fresh pot of coffee was percolating on a table by the door. Jaomi sighed and clicked the mouse. "I can't believe I agreed to this," she moaned as the data reloaded. 8 bids and $47, same as the last 2 hours. "Maybe we should send another email," suggested Ross. The singer was now showing and smelling of his previous all-nighter spent watching DVDs. "Ross, we've spent 30 already, and the seller hasn't replied to any of them," Jaomi complained. "The next one'll be different," Ross insisted. "I can feel it." "But what's the point?" she asked. "No matter how many questions you ask, he won't admit it's a hoax." "Is that what you think it is?" Ross was amazed by his wife's lack of understanding. "You think I'm trying to catch him out?" "Well, aren't you?" she asked, stopping to look at him. "Come on! I want to know who the seller is and how they found Jason. I want to know what Jason looks like, you know? The details. I want to get excited about this thing. Come on, join in!" Jaomi's chin slumped onto her breast. "Ross," she began, "the only question you should ask is how much these guys are going to sting you for." "Hey," he pushed away from the desk. "You promised to help, remember?" "I know, but—" "Just send the damn message," he yelled. Suddenly there was a bad feeling in the room. Jaomi bit her tongue and switched grudgingly to the mail program as Ross got up out of his chair. "You know, Jaomi," he said, "sometimes I think you don't know me at all." "No, you don't know me," she corrected, resending the same mail for the 31st pointless time. "Oh, I know you, all right," Ross shook. "It's you who doesn't know me. If you did, you'd know how important this is to me. All this, it's not a hoax. If it was, there'd be special effects, photos, the whole 9 yards. But there's nothing. That's how I know it's real." "Great," she nodded. "You know it's real because there's nothing there." "You don't have to shout if you're the man. Like your brain? It's only the little people who jump, Jaomi. Just a big, big space with... But this guy's not jumping at all. He's just sitting there with Jason, typing in the dark." "You're not listening to me at all, are you?" "I've waited all my life for this moment. It's Jason Voorhees. Jason fucking Voorhees. I've gotta have him." Now it was Jaomi's turn to stand up. "Fine," she said, heading for the door. "I'll come back 30 seconds. 30 seconds from the end and use my blocker." Ross stepped in her way. "Wait, where are you going?" "Bed," she answered, flicking back her hair. "I'm tired and I'm bored." "But I need you in here in case something goes wrong. You're my manager now, remember? So from now on you do as I say." "Oh, is that right?" Jaomi smiled, but she was seriously pissed, and the cattiness of her voice was not lost on Ross. "It is, if you want to keep your job," he told her. Excuse me?" Jaomi angled her head in ersatz confusion. "Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't your relationship with Ferranti mostly him telling you to fuck off?" Now it was Ross's turn to feel angry. "Was that how it looked to you?" he seethed, quaking with buttoned-up petulance. "Well, yes, now that you come to ask, it did. Ferranti called and you ran. That's exactly how it looked. And I don't see why this is to change. If you guys had a system, I can run with that." At which point Ross wanted to kill her. But instead he gave her a simple ultimatum. "I'm serious. If you leave this room, you're fired. Don't even try to come back." She then left the room. Gripping the travel bag, Special Agent Kyler walked back to where her car had left the trail. From that viewpoint, it seemed impossible she'd survived. The initial drop was almost vertical, and the Chrysler must have plummeted 40 or 50 feet before hitting the tops of the pine trees. She could see a dark crater where the vehicle had entered the forest and where, down below, her partner lay unconscious. Quickly, she retraced the footsteps she'd made on her previous ascent. She didn't have a flashlight, so following her own tracks seemed like the safest and fastest method for getting back to the car. But she had barely begun to put her feet over the edge when the sound of an explosion caused her to throw herself flat on the ground. Kyler read the blast immediately. It was distant enough not to harm her, but close enough to say she was involved. She rolled over onto her back and looked out as a towering pillar of flame confirmed her worst fears. "Tollison!" The Chrysler had exploded. She pitched forward over the side of the hill and took every knock and scratch that was coming to her. She ran, clawed, stumbled, dived, grabbed onto the branches, and swung. Anything to get to the bottom of the slope as quickly as possible. But as the ground started to level, the fire came out to meet her. The blaze was spreading through the forest with terrifying speed, and Kyler soon found she had to navigate a tortuous route through a maze of conflagration. Smoke entered her lungs, and the heat on her exposed skin was almost unbearable, but she pressed forward, determined to rescue her partner, when finally she saw the Chrysler. Upside down, blackened, bent out of all recognition by the accidental igniting of the fuel tank, the automobile was lost in the white heat of a raging fireball. Kyler tried to get closer, but it was impossible. Corey Tollison was surely dead. Floodlights threw harsh relief over the scattered body parts, disentangling them from the wash of blood and dirt they first appeared to be. The last time Frank Lynch had seen anything like Harper Field was when a 737 had come down in the Catskills. Granted, he wasn't a cop, but he'd been a firefighter long enough to disregard the rumors that just one man could have been responsible for all of this carnage. He looked down on a spill of eternal organs, following their glistening trail back to the smiling face of the young woman they were still attached to. Her parents were standing nearby, weeping and clinging to each other in their misery at the sight of losing their teenage daughter. But Frank didn't know what to say to them. Despite every effort to cordon off the area, too many townsfolk had been affected by this tragedy. They'd all returned to see if their loved ones had escaped. Mostly they hadn't. Up ahead, a boy was still holding hands with his dead father. It looked as if the man died protecting his boy, using himself as a shield. The child's face was streaked with dry tears, and there was blood all over his clothes, but the boy was untouched and unharmed. Elsewhere, a couple of paramedics were struggling to sedate a man who just found his wife stabbed through the mouth with a wooden stake. And beyond them, Frank could see body bags strewn across the field like maggots waiting to be harvested by morgue attendants. The fire had been put out long ago, but Frank had stayed behind to help with the rescue operation. He'd been with the service over 12 years, and he thought he was used to death by now. He'd seen his fair share of burned and suffocated bodies, and he'd had to meet with Lord knows how many grieving parents and people. But there was something about what happened here at Hunt Ridge that made him feel sick to the stomach. The stench of ruined lives was everywhere. It was weird to him that the only children he found dead had been burned to death, not mutilated. Frank Lynch was beginning to wonder just how long this damn night was going to last. Breaking news out of the small town of Hunt Ridge. Now we're just getting reports of over 200 casualties. That's significantly up on the previous estimate of 80 to 90. The news broadcast sounded tiny and remote in the vastness of the Voorhees archive, and yet the transmission was sufficiently clear to hold Morgis's attention as he strode through his collection of homicidal treasures. He sipped on a glass of single malt, weighing up the significance of each word, when suddenly the anchorman went live to a reporter in Hunt Ridge. "According to an eyewitness," said the on-the-spot man, "the attack started quite bizarrely with a sideshow that's more than lived up to its name. A waxworks called Dr. Geistman's Carnival of Terror." And the rest of his report was a catalog of guesswork and scaremongering, anything to pump up the ratings. But the mere mention of Hunt Ridge, the town the FBI agents had been heading towards when the surveillance device was deactivated, was enough to tell Morgis everything he needed to know. He finished his drink and walked back to the semicircular entranceway in front of the elevator. Normally, this part of the museum was kept clear so as to give the owner-curator a grand view of all four aisles each time he entered. Now, however, he'd had one of the items in his collection brought forward and placed into the center. He had special plans for this particular artifact. He looked at it adoringly. It was a tank filled with liquid, and the collector listened as the newscast continued. "I spoke to a man who told me the suspect was wearing a hockey mask. Now, for anyone who's been living in New Jersey over the last 20 years, that's sure to stir up memories of the Crystal Lake massacre." Morgis's eyes narrowed with each amplified syllable. "There's something you're not telling me, Miss Cuyler," he said to himself. He stood back and looked admiringly at the object floating in the tank. "But then," he said with a self-satisfied sneer, "there's something I'm not telling you either." Aching and worn out, Cuyler sat at the foot of the slope. 2 more explosions had torn the vehicle apart before she'd given up any hope of freeing her partner, and the inferno was now raging unchecked. She looked at herself in the orange glow and was depressed by what she saw. There wasn't a part of her that wasn't either scratched or cut or dirty, or torn or streaked with smoke. All in all, she was an absolute mess. She took a deep breath and thought of Tollison. Then she thought of Jason and her mother. And then she hefted the travel bag in her right hand and stood up. Michelle Cuyler had a hill to climb. Three hours had passed, and Freely's pickup was still parked where Alice had nearly crashed it on the side of the road. The lights in the engine were off. Jason lay motionless on the rear bed. Alice's door hung open as she bent over the wheel and sobbed. She cried, she kicked, she twisted in her seat and cursed. She didn't know if it was anger, guilt, or grief she was feeling. It seemed like all three, and she couldn't deal with it. Her confused mind couldn't see beyond the fact of her father's death, and the loss only grew more painful until drunkenness and exhaustion dragged her into the abyss of a deep sleep. It was almost 5 in the morning, and Ross was wired. He'd lost track of how many black coffees he'd had. And the pink carpet around Naomi's desk was a polka dot of foil from all the gum and amphetamines he'd unwrapped. There were now over 50 bids on Jason's body, but the current high was a laughable $270. This against a man who owned millions. Come on, Ross. Naomi's voice was soothing this time, but Ross was so focused on the computer that he jumped in his seat. He looked up and saw her standing in the doorway. She had never been a pajama person and was completely naked. Get some sleep, she implored him. He could feel his pecker hardening, and the lure of a soft mattress was almost irresistible. But this was his hour. This moment in the dead of night was the testing of Dwayne Weinstraub, and by God, he would prove superior to the challenge. You said all you had to say when you quit. For some inexplicable reason, Ross was speaking in a Texan accent. In less than 13 hours, I'm going to be the man who owns Jason Voorhees. So you, Morgus, that loser Varanti, all of you, I'm going to show you all. Oh, Ross, baby, I'm sorry. Naomi came forward and rested his head on her breasts. She stroked his hair, knowing that any form of scalp action was his Achilles heel. I know it's important, she said, trying to make up for earlier. But I really wanted you with me for this, he sulked, sounding Californian a little bit at the end again. Well, if you still want, she smiled, I'll stay up with you. A childlike smile crossed his face. Will you? He asked excitedly. Naomi nodded and kissed him on the brow. Ross had known his wife too long to care much about the silicone hooters bouncing in his face. Instead, he just placed his arms around her and they hugged. Then he looked again at the monitor. He looked into his wife's gleaming face. He looked at the stack of the drugs he hadn't taken yet, and he punched his fist into the air. Yeah, he shouted. Whoever said it's always darkest before dawn is talking bullshit. The time was 5 a.m. The date? Friday the 13th. Okay, this has been chapters 14 and 15 of Friday the 13th Carnival of Maniacs. I just couldn't stop with one chapter tonight. It would have been too short. I wanted to go ahead and knock out 2. We've only got about 64 more pages to go, so probably 2 more uploads, minimum. Did anybody else catch there at the end that Ross threw out the name Morgus? Anybody catch that? I wonder what their connection is and what's going on there. Guys, let me know what you thought of tonight's upload, what you thought of the chapter, everything about it, what you're most excited about going forward in the book, any predictions you have. And I will see you soon with more of Friday the 13th Carnival of Maniacs. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thanks for listening, and there can't be a high-speed pursuit without an explosion.